If you had to name the racing capitals of America, the two names that should be at the top of that list should be Charlotte and Indianapolis. Charlotte is a home of NASCAR's longest race and most of the teams. Indianapolis is a home of IndyCar's biggest race and most of the teams. The Coke 600 and Indy 500 are marquee events held on the same day on two different ends of America's racing spectrum. Despite that fact, these series have crossed over multiple times over the years, and these weren't a success. Everybody knows about the failure of the Brickyard 400, the tire failures of 2008, the low attendance in the following years, the 2017 Crash Fest, the 2018 flood, and most recently, the Cup Series disaster on the road course this past year. NASCAR's time in Indy's home has been miserable, but it's well documented. On the other hand, IndyCar's time in NASCAR's home was equally bad, maybe even worse, yet only remembered for one tragic accident in 1999. This is the untold story of the Visionaire 500k. The year is 1960, it's June 19th, and in Charlotte, North Carolina, the dreams of Brune Smith and Curtis Turner have finally been realized. The Charlotte Motor Speedway was open, but didn't have a stable future ahead by any means. By 1962, the track had already filed for bankruptcy. Despite its bumpy beginnings, the road ahead would thankfully get much smoother. By the end of the 70s, the track was stable and ready to propel NASCAR into its golden age, with the World 600 being one of the Winston Cup Series crown jewel events. NASCAR and Charlotte Motor Speedway were riding high, but the opposite could be said about IndyCar at this time. In 1979, the USAC CART split was well underway and was obliterating the sport from the inside out. Championship Auto Racing Teams, or CART, had partnered with the Sports Car Club of America and had most of the star drivers and teams. Star drivers except AJ Foyt, who sided with USAC. USAC also had the backing of NASCAR, as they didn't want their teams to form a series of their own. This open-wheel civil war eventually led to some very strange IndyCar races that did or didn't happen. CART had cancelled races at Mo Sports in Canada and Rockingham in North Carolina, while USAC had a race at Ontario Motor Speedway that eventually became a CART race in the lead up to the event. American open-wheel racing was looking more like a laughingstock with every passing day as the divide grew stronger. Despite the teams, drivers, and officials knowing that this was killing the sport, the battle still raged on into 1980. Since USAC had the backing of NASCAR, some of the 1980 USAC IndyCar events would take place on NASCAR mainstay tracks. One of these planned USAC races would be at Charlotte Motor Speedway, however, this race would eventually be cancelled. In April of 1980, Indianapolis Motor Speedway president John Cooper helped the series reunite in the form of the Championship Racing League. With this, the USAC races at Charlotte and Talladega were ultimately cancelled. Despite reunifying IndyCar racing, the CRL did nothing to ease hostilities, as not only were the problems that caused the split in the first place unresolved, they couldn't even sanction the Indy 500. In one of the craziest times in American open-wheel racing, there was a real possibility that NASCAR or the NHRA would sanction the Indy 500. Eventually, IndyCar racing would settle down, with CART winning the Civil War and controlling IndyCar racing for years to come. CART wanted nothing to do with NASCAR, so it should come as no surprise that after the failed attempt in 1980, IndyCars wouldn't be racing in Charlotte anytime soon. The first IndyCar split had left IndyCar racing unrecognizable. Even their Triple Crown was gone after Pocono favored NASCAR and Ontario was demolished. This left CART as just being a bootleg American F1, with CART racing on the failed Caesars Palace Grand Prix track and having most of their fields comprised of former F1 drivers. Many fans felt disenfranchised with the state of IndyCar racing, and so was Tony George, so by 1996, he would start up his own series. IndyCar racing had a lot more eyes on it, but it was back in Civil War, and he had two different series conveying two different messages. The CART series had marquee drivers and teams and a mix of ovals and road courses on their schedule. The Indy Racing League, on the other hand, had the Indy 500 but a group of unknown drivers and teams. Although Tony Stewart would eventually become a household name, nobody really knew who he was at the time. The IRL was branded to be as American as apple pie and featured an all-oval schedule. The Indy Racing League was led by Tony George, who was not only the president of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, he was a man who had just brought NASCAR to IndyCar's home. He was friendly with NASCAR executives and needed more ovals to fill up his schedule. All of this would come together to bring IndyCar back to Charlotte. After the IRL tested at Charlotte on September 25th, 1996, it seemed pretty much inevitable that IndyCar would return to NASCAR's home. Shortly after that test, Charlotte was confirmed to be part of the 1996-97 Indy Racing League schedule. The race would be 500 kilometers, under the lights in the heart of the summer. With sponsorship from Visionaire HVAC systems and tape-delayed coverage on CBS, the race was ready to go down on July 26, 1997. Concerns were brought up over the bumpiness of the warm-up lanes, which the drivers had to use when exiting and entering the pits. There's also some concerns over inexperience in the field. Cases of this include Jimmy Kite, who had never gone over 200 miles an hour before entering the weekend, and Vincenzo Sospiri, who is the lead driver of the failed MasterCard Lola F1 team from earlier that year. There's also some troubles for a few drivers entering this race. 1996 co-champions Buzz Calkins and Scott Sharp were both at this race as they were recovering from injuries, along with Team Menard driver Robbie Buell. Jeff Ward was racing for Eddie Cheever that weekend, but the team was withdrawn after practice. And Sam Schmidt would start last despite not even putting in a qualifying time. I also feel like pointing this out, in possibly the biggest what the moment in IndyCar history, Greg Gray would be driving for Richard Childress. Yes, that Richard Childress. Tony Stewart would grab the pole with a qualifying speed of 217.164 miles an hour, over 2.5 miles an hour quicker than Arie Luyendyk, who'd start in second. Getting into the actual race, it was packed with attrition. Jack Miller was the first to fall with an engine failure on lap 13, with Greg Gray following him on lap 30. Arie Luyendyk would suffer from handling issues from the start of the race and would eventually retire from the race after he nearly crashed in turn 4. Tony Stewart would be far ahead of the field for the first third of the race, leading 74 laps until he dropped back in the field. As more drivers dropped out of the race with mechanical issues, the race was developing into a 3-horse race between Billy Boat, Buddy Lazier, and Jimmy Kite. On lap 145, there was a crash between Davey Hamilton, Roberto Guerrero, and Alessio Salazar. Guerrero tried to lap Davey Hamilton when he drifted up the track and hit Hamilton. Both slid into the wall and Alessio Salazar would lose his front wing. Thankfully, there wasn't too much debris, so the race was restarted after a 10-lap caution. After an impressive night, Jimmy Kite would bring out the final caution of the day when he hit the outside wall in turn 4 after a suspension failure. After a few more lead changes, Buddy Lazier would win the inaugural Visionaire 500k. Billy Boat would finish second, and Scott Goodyear would finish third. For a race with 5 separate engine failures and a total of 10 DNFs, it's a miracle that there are only 3 cautions on the day. Overall, this race wasn't that bad, but it wasn't the greatest either. It's one of those races that you'd put in the background while working on stuff. On to the 1998 race now, and it would be aired as a tape-delayed version on TNN this year. Much like the previous edition of the race, there are some drivers who couldn't race in Charlotte. Buzz Calkins and his team had withdrawn from Charlotte and the previous race in Dover with concerns of uncompetitiveness. Alessio Salazar would also miss this race as he was recovering from injuries suffered in a practice crash at Dover. So was Robbie Unser, who had suffered a concussion at Dover. The Dover race that preceded this was absolutely nuts, so if you'd like to hear about that, I've actually made a video about it in the past. Billy Boat was also out of this race as he had suffered injuries in a crash at New Hampshire. Jim Guthrie was returning to the IRL from serious injuries suffered in this crash at Indianapolis. Tony Stewart would once again start this race from pole position with a speed of 220.498 miles an hour. Rain showers would be a slight concern before the race, but thankfully the track would be dried in time for the start. Now, I need to mention a problem with this race, and that is that there isn't any good footage of it. There are 3 versions of this race on the internet. One is a grainy and cut up version of the TNN coverage, the other is a pretty distorted version that only shows the first 25 laps, and the third is a rip of the coverage on Sky Sports, which itself is a rip of the TNN coverage that cuts in before the first restart. I'd be intrigued to see if the Indianapolis Motor Speedway has a copy of this race, but anyways. Before we even got to the start, attrition would make a return. Jim Guthrie dropped it while trying to warm up his tires and lost his front wing. Once the debris was cleared, the 1998 Visionaire 500k would be underway. Greg Gray would get the initial jump on Tony Stewart and lead the first 4 laps. Tony Stewart would then retake the lead on lap 5 and hold it as the first caution came out for Raul Boesel. On the next restart, Scott Sharp, Tony Stewart, and Mark Dismore would have a great battle for the lead, but Stewart would still hold his ground. He continued to hold the lead until lap 23 when Mark Dismore took the lead after Tony's engine began to fail. Engine issues would be the name of the game again this year, with the next 2 cautions coming out for engine failures for Stewart and Eddie Cheever. On lap 105, Scott Sharp would spin in turn 3 and collect Donnie Beechler. Thankfully, both drivers would get out of their cars and avoid injury. During the ensuing yellow, Greg Ray, who was replacing the injured Billy Boats, spun exiting the pits. This led to a glorious interview with AJ Foyt.
Been smiling, AJ. If you guys could stay away from this pit trouble, you'd be in command.
Well, that's quite true. I don't know what the hell's wrong with the crew. I chewed their ads out. I worked them today till they damn near fell down, and all we're doing is making one mistake after another. This is crazy. I'm going to have a meeting in just a few minutes. Thank you.
AJ obviously feels like he's got the fastest team on the track, but it's the team in the pits that's causing him problems at this point.
The rest of the race would be a pretty good show between Jeff Ward, Kenny Brack, and Scott Goodyear, who are all fighting for their first wins of the season. After another 3 cautions and 70 laps, Kenny Brack would win the 1998 Visionaire 500k, his first victory in IndyCar and the first of 3 victories in a row on his way to the 1998 IndyCar Championship. Entering the 1999 edition of the race, fan interest was extremely high, as although the attrition rate of the last 2 runnings was high, the events were deemed a success by the fans, media, and officials respectively. However, it's here where the mood has to get somber. The race was rescheduled to May 1st of 1999, increasing fan interest even more along with the speeds of the cars themselves. Greg Ray's pole speed was an absurd 222.039 miles an hour. A significant increase from not just the year prior, but 1997 as well. The 1999 race would also see the biggest entry list in the Visionaire 500k's history. All of these factors combined into a very tragic accident. Coming through turn 3 on lap 58 of the 1999 Visionaire 500k, Stan Waddles and John Paul Jr. had a massive crash which showered the track in debris. All the debris stayed confined onto the racetrack except for one tire from John Paul Jr.'s car. The gravity of the situation was soon made apparent to the commentary crew and race officials as the field circled the track under yellow for roughly a half an hour. The red flag was soon thrown where shortly after, the announcement was made by track president Humpy Wheeler.
Yeah, Jackie, we've made the decision due to the fact that of the terrible accident up in the 4th turn and the debris that went in the grandstand that will not continue the race. The race is canceled as of right now. And we ask everybody for their patience here in the grandstand in leaving the speedway. And we ask prayers for those who have been injured. And it's a terrible thing that we had to call a race, never had to do this before. But in respect to those people, I think it was the thing to do.
Of the 11 people injured by debris, 3 of them have been killed. Jeffrey Patson, age 32, Randy Padthai, age 21, and Barry Mobley, age 41. The incident had a shocking resemblance to the tragedy at the 1998 US 500. What separated the 2 accidents, though, was the decision to cancel the race, something that didn't happen after the tragedy in Michigan, as the race continued on until the finish. All statistics from the 1999 Visionaire 500k are scrubbed from IndyCar record books. Fans were given refunds, and the teams were reimbursed for entry costs. Despite new catch fencing being made in response to these tragedies, along with wheel tethers becoming compulsory on open-wheel race cars, the Indy Racing League would never return to Charlotte Motor Speedway in the years since. The only time an IndyCar has made a lap at Charlotte Motor Speedway since was Joseph Newgarden's demonstration laps on the Roval in 2019. In recent times, many fans, myself included, have dreamt of IndyCar's return to Charlotte. Although a doubleheader with NASCAR on the road course would probably see a lot of fan interest, a look into this race's history would serve as a warning from the past. From racing civil wars and engine failures to forgotten broadcasts and tragedy, IndyCars at Charlotte have a very cursed history. This was the untold story of the Visionaire 500k.